Hi, it's Camilla from the Sewing Society, and welcome to the Masterclass series. This is the first in a collection of instructional videos where we'll be going in depth on fundamental elements of sewing. This series is great if you're a beginner and you're just starting out on your sewing journey. It's also great if you're an experienced sewer, but you'd just like a refresher and like to try some new methods and broaden your knowledge. Everything is broken down into step by step, and each method has its own chapter to make it easy for you to jump to whatever you'd like to watch. In this masterclass, we're going to be looking at seams and all the different ways that you can apply them. We'll be looking at a total of 11 different seams, including different ways to finish them. We'll also be talking about what application they're best suited to. Okay, let's get started. We're going to start off with the basics. The seam is the line of stitching that joins two pieces of fabric together. And the seam allowance is the amount of fabric to the right of the stitch line. Most seam allowances are 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. The big pattern companies like Simplicity, McCall's, Buttrick use a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. The smaller indie pattern companies use between 1.5 or 1 centimeter seam allowance, or no seam allowance at all, and you need to add it to the pattern yourself. It will state somewhere in the instructions or on the actual pattern pieces, so keep an eye out for that information. The exception to the standard seam allowance measurement used throughout a garment is around areas like collars and sleeve plackets, but the instructions will tell you. It's important to be as accurate as possible when sewing your seams, because if you use a bigger or smaller seam allowance than what has been specified, it will change the fit of the garment. Now I'm going to show you how to sew a straight seam and different ways to finish the raw edges. On your machine, select the straight stitch and set it to 2.5 to 3 on the stitch length setting. On the plate of your machine, there will be markings that measure out different increments away from the needle. We'll use this as a guide for our fabric as we stitch to keep the seam allowance even as we go. To start a basic seam, take your two pieces of fabric that you'd like to join together, right sides facing. Use a couple of pins to keep everything in place. Before we start stitching, hold onto your two threads so that they don't slip away with the first stitches. I'm using a contrasting thread throughout this tutorial so that it's easy for you to see. You'll use whatever thread matches your fabric best. At the beginning and the end of our line of stitching, we'll do a couple of back stitches. This helps to lock the stitches in place and stops them from unraveling. Go nice and slowly and keep your fabric aligned with the markings on the plate. Just a reminder that the seam allowance we're using today is 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. And that's how to sew a basic straight stitch seam. Now we're going to move on to different ways to finish the raw edges. First up, we've got pinking. Pinking is a great option to use on curved seams on items that are being lined, on fabrics that don't fray too much, or tightly woven fabrics such as a cotton lawn. And also if you don't have an overlocker, you do need to have pinking shears, obviously, to be able to do this technique. They're pretty easy to come by. You can get them at most sewing stores. I will link in the description below where you can get some. They last a really long time. I've had mine for years. I've never had to sharpen them or buy a new pair. They are a really good investment to have as a part of your sewing kit. So to start this finish, take your shears and trim away some of the seam allowance. You can leave it just like this, but I'm going to show you how to make this finish a little bit stronger by sewing a straight stitch line as close as possible to the cut edge. This will help with any fraying. Stop at the stitch line. And then give it all a really good press. Next is the zigzag finish. So this is also a great alternative to overlocking. We're going to start with our straight seam and we're going to go to the machine and change the settings to a zigzag stitch. I've got my zigzag width to 2.5 and the length to 2. The idea with the zigzag stitch to finish the edge is to wrap the stitches around the raw edge to prevent fraying. Try to get as close as you can to the edge of the seam allowance without the stitches falling off. And repeat on the other side. Next, we've got an overlocked finish. The overlocker is a really useful machine and can finish lots of different kinds of fabrics, including knit fabric. It's nice in that it trims and finishes off everything in one go. But if you're just starting out on your sewing journey, it's definitely not essential to have an overlocker. You can make anything without one. Definitely go nice and slow when using overlocker. We don't want any missing fingers. Next is turn and stitch finish. This is such a pretty finish and it's a really nice alternative to French seams, especially on seams that are going to be pressed open. To start this finish, we're going to press the seam open and then press under half of the seam allowance. Now, with the body of the fabric out of the way, we're going to do a line of straight stitching to keep that fold in place. And repeat on the other side. Next up, we've got the bound finish. This is a little bit more advanced, but it still uses a straight stitch and bias binding. You can make your own bias binding or get some ready-made. If you haven't tried it before, please give it a go. It's really fun and it makes your garments look so pretty on the inside and even on the outside if you use it on a reversible garment. I'm using a binding that is 2 centimeters wide or 1.5 inches, including a 1/2 centimeter seam allowance on both sides. If you have shop bought binding, it will already have a seam allowance folded in. You can use that fold line as a guide for your stitching. Press one side open and line it up to the edge on one side of your open seam. Next, we're going to stitch it in place. Now we're going to stitch it in place 1/2 centimeter in from the edge. Repeat that on the other side. And then we're going to press the binding away from the seam. To complete this finish, we need to wrap the binding around the exposed edge. Fold the binding over so that it just passes the line of stitching that we just did. This is to ensure that we catch it when we put it through the machine again. Next, stitch as close as possible to the edge of the binding. You can also use this binding method by sandwiching the seam allowances together, so you've just got one piece of binding. I've also used a technique called stitch in the ditch on this sample, where you can't see where I've stitched the binding in place because I have stitched directly on top of where the binding meets the seam allowance. Okay, that completes the finishes part of the tutorial. Next, I'm going to show you a few more seam variations. Next, we've got the double stitch seam. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's 2 lines of straight stitch. This is used on garments like workwear, jeans, trousers, especially for inner seams, seams that have a lot of stress on them, and hard-wearing garments. First, we're going to do our usual straight stitch seam, 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then do a second line of stitching a couple of millimeters away from that stitch, but within the seam allowance. Then you can finish the raw edges with any technique that you like that we've just covered. Next is the French seam. This is such a beautiful technique. It's perfect for using on delicate and lightweight fabrics, and for sheer fabrics where you might see the seam through the garment. This makes it all look really pretty. I'm going to show you this technique using a printed fabric so that you can see there's an obvious wrong and right side. To start, we need to place our pieces of fabric wrong sides together. So this feels a bit weird, it's counterintuitive, but trust me, it'll all work out. To start off, we're going to do a straight seam, but with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then we're going to trim that seam allowance back down to about 4 millimeters, or a little bit under half the seam allowance. Next, we're going to press the seam to one side . And then flip it over . Fold it in half and press along the seam line. We're going to go back to the machine and do another row of straight stitching 5 millimeters away from the folded seam edge. By doing this, we should encase the raw seams, creating a really lovely finish. Next is flat felled seams. I'm going to show you 2 different ways that you can do this. Again, this seam is really good for workwear and for use on jeans, jackets, and even shirts. First, we've got our straight seam, and then we need to trim one side of the seam allowance down to half. Next, we're going to wrap the side of the seam that we've just cut in half with the other side of the seam allowance, so it encloses the raw edge, like this. Stitch as close as possible to the folded edge, going through all layers of the fabric. Another way to do a flat felled seam is with your 2 pieces that you want to join together. Take one piece and line it up 1 centimeter away from the edge, like this. Now we're going to wrap the under piece of fabric over to the top and stitch really close to that raw edge. Next, we're going to press the seam over, covering this line of stitching that we just did. Then sew through all the layers of fabric really close to that folded edge. This method makes the flat fell seam a little bit stronger than the previous method. Next is the welt seam. This is very similar to a flat felled, but it's kind of like a mock one. It doesn't have as many steps, but has a really similar look. We're going to start off with our straight seam and then finish off the seam allowance with the overlocker. We need to trim the seam allowance down to about half again, and we can use the overlocker to do this step all in one. We're going to overlock the seam allowance together, not open. After overlocking, we're going to press the seam down to one side. Then from the right side of the fabric, we're going to top stitch it down in place. I'm going to use the edge of my foot as a guide, but the stitch line should be about 1/2 centimeter away from the seam line, or 1/4 inch. The last seam I have to show you in this tutorial is a lapped seam. This seam is used on fabrics that don't fray, like leather or felted wool. It's really simple, but is very effective for these kinds of fabrics, especially if they're a bit bulky. First, you need to mark the seam allowance on both pieces of fabric, with right sides facing up. Trim back the seam allowance on one of the pieces. Now line it up on top of the other piece, lining up the cut edge with the seam allowance mark. Pin it in place, and we're going to stitch a couple of millimeters away from that cut edge. You can trim away the excess on the underside if you like, or leave it as it is. And that's it. I really hope you enjoyed this masterclass on seams. I hope there was some useful information there for you and some new things that you can apply to your makes going forward. As always, let me know if you've got any questions. I'd love it if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Keep an eye out for the next in this series, and I'll see you very soon.